A landlord on the verge of bankruptcy wrote a note to a tenant begging them to pay rent. And in Los Angeles, landlords are suing over new eviction protections for tenants. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have a couple of interesting articles for you today, and one of them is coming out of Canada, and it's actually about a landlord who wrote a note to a tenant begging them to pay the rent because they're on the verge of bankruptcy. They're about to lose everything, and they have a professional tenant in their unit that is just delaying the process, and they just get further and further in debt. This is one of those horrible case situations that I tell you about all the time where a small mom and pop landlord just cannot survive. Now, the second story I have is coming out of Los Angeles, and it's about this lawsuit that the landlords have against the Los Angeles city for the new eviction protections that they put in place. Now, I've covered the new eviction protections, and obviously, you know what, any protections that they put in there that make it so landlords have to limit what they can do on rent increases and makes it so that they can't evict tenants as easily, well, those are bad, okay? I will never support any legislation like that. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like, subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think, okay? Now, my question for you is, now this goes back to the story about the landlord who wrote the note to the tenant. Now, would you ever consider doing something like this if you had a really bad tenant in your property? And I realize that this isn't going to work probably. Now, obviously, you file all the eviction and all the paperwork and everything, and this landlord about to lose everything and be financially destroyed is doing the last thing within their power and begging this tenant to pay the rent or leave. And, this tenant is a professional tenant, right? So they are there to screw the landlord over. This is why I say you can't have sympathy. You can't be the nice guy when you're a landlord. You have to be the bad guy. And you know what? If that's the way it has to be, you don't get taken advantage of by these bad tenants, then so be it. Okay, but would you ever consider writing a note such as this to a tenant, with the hopes of maybe getting them to leave? I certainly wouldn't. I wouldn't waste my time. Okay, but I feel my heart, it goes out to the landlord who did this because they are in a really, really bad place right now. So anyway, let's get into the first article, and that goes over what's happening in Los Angeles. So this article is coming from therealdeal.com, and it says AAGLA lawsuit demands LA repeal some renter protections. Yeah, and they put in a whole bunch of renter protections after the end of their city eviction moratorium. And basically, it's bad, okay? And I'm going to go cover exactly why it's bad as we go through this article. A property owners association has filed a legal challenge to some of the renter protections in the Los Angeles City Council approved at the beginning of the year, claiming key parts of the legislation conflict with state law and should be repealed. Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles filed a complaint March 3rd in Los Angeles Superior Court. It's the group's latest challenge against the city's recent initiatives backed by the City Council's progressive wing. One of these new rules is the City Council's ordinance on just cause for eviction. The new rule makes it more difficult for landlords to evict tenants. Property owners only can initiate an eviction or an unlawful detainer when the amount of money due exceeds 1 month of fair market rent in the Los Angeles area, according to the new law. So basically, the first month is on you if you're a landlord there, right? You have to just take that loss. The loss has to exceed 1 month of rent, right? Which means for the entire first month that they're late, no big deal until month number 2, and now they owe you 2 months of rent. Then you can file eviction. That doesn't mean the eviction is going to go through anytime quickly, and remember, the just cause rules say also that you just can't end your lease, so after the 12-month period is up or however long your lease is, you just can't tell the tenant, well, I'm not going to renew this. You have to go. No, that's now considered an eviction, and you can't do that. Okay, if the tenant continues to pay the rent, then they get to stay. But remember what I also said before in my other video about how if you increase the rent too high, well, guess what? Now you have to pay the tenant. That's right. They created some ridiculous rule that says you have to pay the tenant if they have to move because they can't afford the rent. So yeah, I mean, they have created so many new rules and so many new regulations that they are putting a huge burden on landlords. And I'm not talking about just they always paint the image of a landlord as some guy, off in the Bahamas somewhere drinking, fancy beverages, sitting on the beach, with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property. Well, you know what this really will hit? This will hit the small mom and pop landlords. The person who, hey, I owned a smaller home where we lived, my family lived, and we moved out and bought another home, and we decided rather than sell our old place, we're just going to rent it out. And then we got a tenant in there, and guess what? Now the tenant is taking advantage of the situation, and I am getting this completely financially destroyed. And that's going to happen to a lot of small mom and pop landlords, and I don't want to see it. AAGLA's complaint says that this rule conflicts with state law. Cheryl Turner, an attorney and president of AAGLA's board, said the city threshold would be a major financial burden for landlords. Now owners may have to wait months or even years, at which point the past due rent will likely never be collectible, and renters may now stay housed in violation of their lease agreement without recourse. The city's ordinance has clearly created a scenario where renters, not the property owners, can effectively establish the amount of rent they wish to pay, Turner said in a prepared statement. AAGLA's complaint also took issue with relocation assistance for renters they evict. The complaint argues that the fees for relocation assistance would prohibit landlords from raising rents. Yeah, basically they've put a de facto kind of under the radar rent control in there. They say, well, if you raise your rents over a certain percentage, then you have to pay this huge relocation cost to these tenants, right? And the landlords who aren't able to do that, they just be like, well, I just can't raise my rents to what I need to raise them to. So basically, they've put in an under the table sort of rent control in there into this law. And, that's wrong as well. These rules also break the 1995 Costa-Hawkins Act, which puts limits on municipal rent control ordinances for residential housing categories such as single family homes, condominiums, and newly constructed apartments, the complaint argues. A representative for the LA City's attorney office did not answer a request for comment. And since the pandemic, AAGLA has mounted legal challenges to the efforts of the city councils and LA County to change rent laws. In March 2022, AAGLA filed a lawsuit against joint lawsuit with Apartment Owners Association of California against Los Angeles County, seeking relief against enforcement of the county's residential eviction moratorium. A preliminary injunction was granted. Yeah, so this home or landlords association basically has been fighting this anti-landlord stuff for a while now, and as you can tell, things are only getting worse. Okay, like I said, California is not one of those places I personally would want to invest. Now, I do know there are a lot of really successful landlords out there, ones who make way more money than I ever even could imagine, right? And so, more power to you if you have the guts and the determination to deal with this ridiculous bureaucratic nonsense. But I don't, okay? And I say for newer real estate investors, look for a market that's a little bit more friendly. That's just my personal suggestion, okay? So anyway, let's get into this second story because it's quite interesting. And it goes over the fate of a landlord who basically is getting screwed over by a professional tenant. Now, this story is coming out of Canada, but it still applies to landlords in places like California, where it's extremely difficult to evict tenants. So this article is coming from blog2.com, and it says, Toronto landlord leaves a handwritten note to tenant begging them to pay rent. All right, let's get into it. It's not a very long one, so. A Toronto landlord recently left a handwritten note to their tenant, begging them to pay their rent after months of failing to do so. Oh, lost it there for a second. Samir Singh Hania, who lives in an apartment building in South Riverdale, told Blog 2 that he noticed the letter attached to his neighbor's door, who allegedly moved in last September. And here's a quote from the letter. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll read the letter. They have a picture of it here in the article. And you make what you want from it, okay? You are $9,000 behind in rent now. The landlord cannot afford to pay the mortgage. taxes, maintenance, etc. without your rent. The landlord is on the verge of bankruptcy. Please do the right thing by paying your rent or moving out. I am not an evil landlord. I'm just trying to make my ends meet. Let's work together to find a solution. Thanks, landlord. Yeah. Now this is probably a last ditch effort to try to get this tenant to maybe have some sympathy, but this is a professional tenant. The only thing they care about is basically stealing from the landlord, getting as much as they can for free, and then moving on and then doing the same thing with the next landlord. Okay, so obviously all the new laws and rules and regulations making it extremely difficult to rent, they don't take these sort of people into consideration at all. Okay, they don't think about the unintended consequences of making eviction so difficult that people like this can take advantage of a poor landlord who just has one property. They don't even think about stuff like that. And this is the kind of situation that happens. So now you have a landlord who is literally on the verge of bankruptcy, probably going to lose the house, foreclosure, and there's nothing that can be done about it. And meanwhile, the people who make the laws are like, well, yeah, whatever. Okay, you didn't think about the unintended consequences. You didn't think about how landlords could actually be punished through your laws and your rules, right? And that's why I tell you, I only invest in places where I know that I have, strong property rights, and I know that I can do my business the way that I need it to be done. Okay. So, yeah, this is kind of a warning letter to landlords when you're investing in places like, New York, New Jersey, and in California, places with these extremely strong protections, Washington State. Well, guess what? This sort of thing could happen to you.